Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments onto most of the platforms you might be watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room. And hello to Invisible Friend in the chat room. Invisible Friend wishes us all a good morning. And I wish you a good morning too, Invisible Friend. Today, my subject is relevance. And 1 year ago today, I addressed this subject in a midday. And I thought it was time to address it again, but it also continues my theme for this week. I started the week with the subject of the term baby witch and explored that from the point of view of keeping things in perspective and choosing your fights, and also relevance. On Tuesday, we talked about appearances and presentation, particularly in terms of clothes and color. Um, and the relevance of this, of course, is how people react to you. Yesterday, I did a best of about the idea um, about the good old days having been so much better because things were less available. Um, Today, I want to talk about relevance. Relevance is the question of whether something is or is not important. In your own life, it's the question of, is something important to you? Is something relevant in your life? Does what it offers you equal what it requires from you? And I would say, when we argue over terminology, the answer to that is no. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. I would argue that when we focus on appearances and how we present ourselves and interact with people, the answer is yes. And I would say that when we talk about the availability of things and the accessibility of things, um, it's always better to have access to things. They're always relevant to us. The other part of relevance is your relevance to the world, to your community. Particularly if you are in the position of any form of leadership or activism or media or any of these things, and hello, Unique One in the chat room. It's good to see you, Unique One. One of the questions you must always reasonably ask yourself is, am I being relevant? Because if you're not relevant, why does anyone want to pay attention to you? I often talk about um, those elders who complain that no one listens to them. But one of the questions that I think those people don't very often ask themselves is what I'm saying relevant to younger people? Why do they not listen? They simply think it's owed to them, and it's not. Um, you have to be relevant to have an influence. If you're not relevant, well, you're irrelevant. And it's really just that simple. And what does relevance mean? Well, it means that you offer more than you require, in my opinion. That what you're saying is worth the effort of its application. And going back to some of the examples that we've talked about, um, arguing over, well, let's say, for example, quarter colors, something I've seen very often during my pagan career. People are insisting, no, the quarter colors must be exactly this. They cannot vary. What is the relevance of this? What do you get if you win? What do you lose if you don't? And the answer is very little either way. At most, you might get some political dominance, and hello to Reverend Ed Carr in the chat room, and you might lose some. But even then, it doesn't amount to much. But all the energy that you put into that argument could have been used for practical things with real effects in the world. And the truth is, people around the world have used different quarter colors since time immemorial. Um, every culture has had its own take on it, and many of them have had more than one. And certainly modern metaphysics has more than one and has for a very long time. So arguing about it is ridiculous. Arguing about what people call themselves. It's fine to have an opinion. It might even be fine to have a conversation about it, but to argue about what someone else is calling themselves, for the most part, offers nothing because you can't make them call themselves what you want them to call themselves. And the most you're likely to achieve is alienating them. Where's the relevance of that? What is the purpose of that? I realize that for many people, stopping to think about the purpose of your actions and their potential outcomes isn't necessarily intuitive. It's a learned skill, but it's a vitally important skill in life. And, a lot of people, I think, run on autopilot. And they get into these arguments and expend their energy in ways they didn't think about before they did it, and never stop to think about where it could lead, either good or bad. And I think we see this very strongly in the era of witch wars in the pagan community, most of which were over irrelevant subjects. And yeah, they had a practical effect for certain people who were using them to build political power, but they didn't build it very well. They built it by tearing everything down around them so that they would seem larger, but they didn't actually, for the most part, build themselves, and then wondered why they became overwhelmed afterwards. Or, to go back to another subject, wondered why people weren't listening to them after all that negativity. The witch war period in the Wiccan community was incredibly damaging, not only inside the community, but to the community's relationship with the rest of the metaphysical community. Because nobody ever stopped to think what they were doing and what its results would be. We are now in a situation, the whole world is in this situation, but we are too, where a lot of things are happening that have long-term effects in the political world, in the economic world, in the spiritual world. These things are going to be with us for a long time, and we cannot just go through this on autopilot, indulging in emotional masturbation every time we turn around because it felt good to argue about something. Or we just had to express this one opinion that made it impossible to then work with anyone else. We need to think about what we're doing. We need to have a little self-control if we want to have any kind of good outcome. And, maybe you're terribly, terribly attached to that one particular term to the point that you're willing to alienate everybody who doesn't use it. But understand that when you face a real challenge, you're not going to just be able to brush that over. You'll be standing there separated from those other people who might have been able to help you. This is something that's worth considering. And so often I think people don't consider it. It's not only a pagan issue. Particularly in the US, but not only in the US, in current society, people have really been trained over the course of about 30 years to immediately go to the most divisive places and to fall immediately into arguing, to the point that large numbers of people could not possibly work together. This is not in their own interests. This is not wise, nor is it easily overcome. And, if we look at the recent wildfires in Los Angeles and some of the reactions that we see from certain quarters, we see a great deal of pettiness and vindictiveness being expressed in a moment when you would hope people would come together. But what does this mean for tomorrow? Well, it means those people who can't come together today certainly aren't going to come together tomorrow. And hello to Steve Taylor in the chat room. I'm not sure how I would feel if I were an ordinary person who lived in Los Angeles and had lost my home and everything else, only to find people from a certain background hurling political invective in my direction, um, and refusing help, when later the situation might be reversed and they were in need of help. I'm not sure I'd be able to find it in myself to offer it. I think that's something some of these people should be thinking about. Tearing down these structures that allowed people to come together and help each other regardless of political affiliation, regardless of geographical location, tearing those things down is not good for anyone. And it's most damaging to the people in the poorer areas, not a wealthy city like Los Angeles. They, if they must, can pull themselves up in a way that, well, for example, North Carolina could not. If they can't get national aid, there is so much money there they can aid themselves. Not every place can do that. And the ability to come together and work together in moments of national disaster is far more important than momentary political disagreements. And hello to Mavis Ann Doak in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mavis Ann. But this is part of what I mean by relevance. There are a lot of people presently who want to grab for their immediate political benefit and not consider where the train goes next. Tearing down some of these situations may give an immediate emotional rush, but what is it going to do tomorrow? And I think very few people are thinking about that. And those who are thinking about it, and some of them I'm sure are, they're not thinking about it in our interests. They're thinking about what it brings to them. And I think you're going to find that losing some of these group efforts that we have built over the years is not going to be good for anyone. But I think we'll continue to see people trying to tear them down. Now, what does that mean to our pagan community? What does it mean to our metaphysical community? I hope it means that we can see from this example how counterproductive that kind of thing is. That we can avoid momentary emotional gratification that might come from arguing over unimportant issues and simply agree to disagree so that we can still work together tomorrow. I would hope that we would learn from this the importance of valuing the ability to come together as a whole over the momentary exaltation of whatever our particular group might be. Because very few of us are going to have the strength to stand alone. I'm not going to say no one, but very few. And the things that any of the larger groups would have to do to be able to stand alone against, for example, legal challenges and social challenges are far more complex than what we could all do together. Now, the good news is I don't think the major groups are given to this sort of thing. It's the small groups that do it. I think that most of the major organizations in our community can work together with no particular problem and have on many occasions and undoubtedly will on many more. And that has to do with the people who run them. But, I look back on those witch wars and how many people were willing to basically shaft their community for a momentary emotional or political gain. And unfortunately, I don't see that energy being gone. I see it being less. But what I would hope is that when we see people trying to start fights that don't need to be had, they will first not buy into it, and secondly, if it's in our power, shut it down. That we will focus instead on coming together and being able to work together, even if we're not always in perfect agreement. Even sometimes if we're in substantial disagreement. And hello to Ashleen in the chat room. Ashleen says, oh man, the witch wars were so silly. Well, they were silly in the sense that they were a huge waste of time and resources and a decimation of the Wiccan community. And other communities known by other names today who at the time were part of the Wiccan community. It was a huge waste of advantage, a huge waste of years of work and organization to try to promote certain individual groups and people who, for the most part, failed to promote themselves in the long run anyway. Although I do think some of them did get what they thought they wanted, which was to be the biggest fish in a small pond. And, all I can say is, the next couple of years, the big fish in the small ponds, we'll see what that's really worth. It might have been better to be a smaller fish in a larger pond that had more ability to survive, or at least to survive well. And, I think a lot of this, well, all in the end comes back down to the idea of relevance. Not only our relevance in the world, but the relevance of our actions to ourselves and to others. And Ashleen says most of those fish aren't even alive anymore, and that's true. A lot of them are not. A lot of the people who caused those problems aren't even living now. Many of the groups that caused that incessant fighting did not survive. They were taken down by their own waves. Those that did survive, for the most part, are no longer so quick to fight. I just wish they'd realized it sooner when they could have saved more. So many once vital communities were left in ashes by this. Some of them have been able to rebuild. Some have rebuilt and imploded again. And others have rebuilt and stood. And hopefully they will continue to do so. Because that is our hope for the future. Because the one thing that would be an incredible waste of people's lives is if, because we'll survive one way or another, but if we survive no better than we were 100 years ago, we have really wasted a lot of time. And, those of us who spent our lives trying to, for want of a better way to put it, make the world safe for paganism, would end up feeling very foolish about ever considering doing it again. Now, Ashleen says most of those still here are also forgotten. That's true. It's true, and they were so busy fighting each other, they didn't think about the future, which went on without them. And it's very easy to hear those older people complain about how bad the younger generation of witchcraft is because it's not like them. But why would it be like them? They didn't embrace it. For the most part, they barely communicated with it. Many of them went out of their way to alienate young people. Um, but those younger people who were interested in metaphysics had lots of ways to learn other than dealing with those people. And to those who still survive and want to be relevant, you still can. You just need to look at the world, look at the people, and find out not how they can fit themselves to you, but how you can communicate to them, because they're not going to fit themselves to you. They are not going to meet you where you are because they have no reason to. They have other resources. Um, you have to find how to communicate with them. And hello to Kayleen in the chat room. And Kayleen is joining us from Australia. It's good to see you, Kayleen. Thank you for joining us. And Ashleen says, I was so happy coming from a closed path. I saw and heard it all, but didn't let the toxic BS affect me. Well, I'm glad that it didn't affect you. I was right in the middle of it oh so often. I often talk about how during the 90s and early 2000s, for a period of 17 years, we dealt with at least one witch war every single year. Until finally, we were too big to be susceptible to it, except within. And we've had a couple of internal witch wars, but they really didn't amount to much. But the external ones really no longer affect us, which to me says if you keep being relevant, you keep doing the work, you will at least outpace those who will pull you down. But you have to keep doing it. And Kayleen says, sadly, I came across this sort of problem in other communities as well, with similar long-term damage. Well, yes. It's not just our problem. It's a human problem. And I obviously focus on the witch wars and the effect on our metaphysical community because that's my experience in my community. But it's not just us. And in finding answers for this, we're looking for answers that can be applied across the board. Looking for answers that really can improve everyone's experience. Years ago, Ed the Pagan wrote the book, The Witch Wars Defense Manual, that exposed a lot of the techniques that people had used in fighting witch wars. It's one of the reasons, in my opinion, that the witch wars stopped, because having had these techniques exposed, they were no longer effective in the way they had been. And I highly recommend that book to you. You can download it for free through Corellium Publishing. And you can buy the subsequent version, The Witch Wars Defense Manual 2, How to Win, which is heavily updated and deals a lot more with reputational warfare in our current world. But, and honestly, if we look at the political situation in the United States and many other countries at present, it's the same situation. It's witch wars in a political world, witch wars in a mundane political world. Very often the same techniques, the same behaviors. Understanding them is important. Not giving in to them is important. And I guess it's always going to be the case that there will be people who try to do these things, partly because I guess it's intuitive to humans. To fight over irrelevancies, to fight for minor dominance, to attack people rather than ideas, to lie on many occasions, because one of the primary weapons in the witch wars was falsehood, because an awful lot of the accusations that were thrown about in those days were not in the end true, or if they were true, they weren't quite the way they were said. And here is why yesterday's program is very relevant in part. The idea that it was so much better when things were less accessible. Well, one of the reasons those witch wars could use false accusations is that we had a lot less communication in those days. It was a lot harder to find out that, yeah, something someone was saying might not have been quite what really happened, or quite the way they're portraying it. Today, we have a lot more communication. I think that is definitely for the better. I would not go back to the more isolated days of yore for anything. And my strongest ambition for our community is that we not be dragged back there, because I'm quite certain that the Christian nationalist movement would love to drag us back to our former isolation, and would love to see us socially isolated from the wider society and from each other. And they have a lot of tools to do this that we need to be mindful of, and I'll probably be talking about one of those tomorrow. But if you're following the news, you'll notice that the lady Belladonna Laveau of the Aquarian Tabernacle Church recently talked about how she had Googled the metaphysical uses of pumpkin and gotten basically a pro-Jesus witnessing from Google. This is really very concerning. It is far more dangerous to our community to have these social engines turned against us in this non-legislative, extra-legal, social sort of way than any legislation that might be passed against us. Because legislation we can fight. What do we do about Google? And the answer is there's very little we can do about it. We have to find ways to take it in stride and react to it, and we have to assume we're going to see more of it. We see this also in some of the grammar programs that do not recognize words that have pagan reference, and probably aren't going to in many cases. One of the things that can be most used to damage our community is limiting our ability to communicate, making it harder to use the words we commonly use, through things like autocorrect that makes it hard for us to type them. It may not have occurred to you that that's a weapon, but that is a weapon. And if the people who are running those companies choose to use it that way, they certainly can. These are very relevant concerns, but for the most part, I don't think our people ever think about. But we need to be thinking about them, because they may very well be deployed against us, and seemingly are. And we have, at the very least, the immediate future, the Christian nationalist movement is in total ascendancy. And we have to expect them to do what they can do, and what they've always said they would do. And it's very foolish of us to think anything else is going to happen. So our question is, what do we do about it? How do we react to it? And fighting among ourselves is not the right answer. With that, we've come toward the end of our half hour. I want to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. Ready to unlock the secrets of the universe? Join me, Rev Don Lewis, for my metaphysical and magic auctions at Gaia Thrift at whatnot.com. Discover fascinating artifacts, mystical crystals, and rare and unusual books that could change your life. Don't miss this chance to bring a little magic into your world. Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions, where the extraordinary can become yours. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub and Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions. Gaia Thrift has reopened from our holiday vacation, and we'll have news of our next auction for you soon. Meanwhile, you can go to our websites, our Facebook page, Gaia Thrift, also GaiaThrift.com. You can look at our eBay pages and so forth and find many wonderful things available. With that, I want to thank you for watching. I had a wonderful compliment yesterday. Yesterday, I had run a best of program on the subject of the good old days. And I was asked afterwards if I'd forgotten to run the sponsors. And I said, well, no, it was a best of. We didn't have sponsors at that moment, at that time. And the response was, well, wow, it was so relevant, I didn't realize it was a best of. And that kind of made my day. And Kayleen says, thank you. It was well worth getting up at 5 a.m. here. Thank you, Kayleen, for doing that. We're very glad to have you join us. We hope we see you again. And with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. We rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we ask you to help us to always consider both the motivations and the results of our actions. Help us to keep ourselves relevant, positive, and constructive in our lives and our actions and activities. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love, knowing you are always with us. From respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always, and I will see you again tomorrow when we will have our weekly roundup of stories. And until then,